Hi folks, thanks for joining me for today's Innsmouth excursion, and I'm down in London today, Hammersmith to be precise, to attend the Dragon Meat Gaming Convention. Now Hammersmith is an area that's very familiar to me, at least it used to be, because in the late 70s into the 80s I used to come down here a lot to see bands, the Hammersmith Apollo, the Odeon of course, lots of other little venues. And there was also a venue down here called the Clarendon that I used to play a lot at as well, particularly in the Surfadelics. We used to play Mike Spencer's Garage Nights quite regularly. And the Clarendon was a great old venue. Everyone played there. The Cramps, the Damned, all the punk bands played there. I think AC/DC had one of their first UK gigs there. So a really amazing and characterful old venue. Hammersmith Broadway has changed somewhat since those times. This is what the Clarendon used to look like. And this is what it looks like now. So, as you can see, I'm taking a little while to get my bearings. But I thought while I'm here, I couldn't miss out on the opportunity to tell you about one of London's greatest hauntings, the story of the Hammersmith ghost. So, let's pop down to St Paul's Church, where it all started. So yes, our story begins here in the grounds of St Paul's Church in the heart of Hammersmith. This was built in the 17th century and largely rebuilt in the late 1800s. As you can imagine, back then this area looked very different. It was really a rural area, and so of course today a lot of the churchyard, in fact most of it, has been lost, and as you can see we're directly in the shadow of the flyover. So it's a very different scene back on the 15th of December 1803 when Thomas Groom, who was a local drayman at a brewery, was walking through the churchyard at night with his friend. And he claims that he was suddenly seized. He felt as though he was seized by a pair of hands round his throat that pulled him back and started to strangle him. Groom said that this grip tightened and he was turned around, he was spun around. There was no one there, but the grip was still on him. So he pushed out, he lashed out with his hands. And he said he felt something soft and yielding, like a greatcoat, something that softly flapped away as he pushed it. He was released and he staggered away. And this was one of the first examples or experiences of what became known as the Hammersmith ghost. A lot more happened a little bit down the road in Black Lion Lane, so that's where we're going next. Black Lion Lane and the surrounding area was where the next set of sightings occurred. Over a period of quite a few weeks, this was a phenomenon that went on for quite a while. And again, you have to remember, back at this time, 1803, this was a very rural area. None of these houses would have been built then. And by all accounts, Black Lion Lane was surrounded by fields and meadows, and it had tall hedges on each side. Of course, no street lighting back in those days, apart from the old night watchman, so also it would be pitch black unless we had a nice gibbous moon. Now, speaking of watchmen, on Thursday the 29th of December, William Girdler, who was a local watchman, he was basically hired by the people around here to go out and patrol and also to sound the hours. At 10 o'clock that night, he reported seeing a tall whitish figure with a sheet over its head. As I approached, the person ran off, but I lost him in the darkness. And Girdler's report presaged a whole series of occurrences, including one where passengers in a coach going down the lane reported seeing this ghostly white figure chasing a shrieking woman along the darkened road. And the report says none of them durst venture out in order to assist the beleaguered female. That's just great, isn't it? The Morning Post reported the driver of another coach saying that he was coming down the lane one night, he heard a strange rustling, and he looked up, and by the sight of the moon he saw this spectral apparition gliding across the meadow towards him. He was so scared he just jumped from the coach and ran back into town to get some help. He gathered together a group of men. They returned to the scene. There was nothing there, but the horses pulling the coach, their reins had been cut, and the horses were quite happily grazing on the meadow. And this created such a stir and so much fear in the area that local clergymen offered 5 guineas for apprehension of this phantom. That, in early January of that year, led, as you might imagine, to gangs of armed men roaming the streets, trying to apprehend the phantom, trying to get that reward. I guess 5 guineas was quite a considerable sum back in those days. And this is the background. This all leads us up to the tragic events of the night of Tuesday, January the 3rd. On that night, a young excise officer called Francis Smith, who was by all accounts a good-tempered young man, decided to go out and join the hunt for the ghost. So he armed himself with a fowling piece, which is a sort of like a light shotgun, and off he went. At 10:30 he met Girdler, the watchman who we mentioned earlier, on the corner of the street, and Girdler said, "I've got to do my rounds a bit more, I've got to call the hour, but 11 o'clock, let's meet up." They agreed to do that, but then they thought, well, it's so dark, you can barely see your hand in front of your face kind of thing. It's so dark, we should set up a password. So they decided to do this, and the password was, "Who comes there?" The reply was going to be "friend," and then the response from there was "advance friend." So pretty straightforward. Also at this time, Thomas Millwood, who was a young 22-year-old bricklayer from the area, was visiting his parents. He was going to spend a little bit of time at his parents, then he was going to go and collect his wife, who was working. She was doing some ironing nearby. He was going to collect her and walk her home. Now, what a bricklayer would wear at that time, and in fact what Millwood was actually wearing on that night, were white linen trousers, a white flannel waistcoat, a white apron and white shoes. I think you can see where this is heading. And of course, halfway down the lane he encountered Smith, who by all accounts cried out twice, got no response, so opened fire. And poor old Millwood was killed instantly. Apparently the shot went through his mouth and came out through the back of his neck, so severing his spinal cord. Smith ran to get help, a crowd gathered, and Millwood's body was taken down to the Black Lion Inn, just down the other end of the street here. Smith, of course, was apprehended and arrested, put into custody, and he went very willingly. Dr. Flower, the local medic, carried out the autopsy the next day at the Black Lion Inn, and there was absolutely no doubt that Millwood had been killed by the gunshot. Millwood had been killed by Smith. Smith was sent to trial at the Old Bailey in front of 3 judges and charged with murder, to which he pleaded not guilty. He said, "Look, this is a total accident. I didn't mean to kill anyone." That was his basic defence. A lot of witnesses were called, some of the people we mentioned already, including Thomas Groom, which is where we get his account of what happened to him. The head judge, Sir Archibald MacDonald, summed up by saying, "Well, you might say it was a mistake, but murder is a murder. You went out with a gun, you shot someone, whatever your intentions were, you murdered him." The jury was sent out, and after some deliberation they came back with a verdict of manslaughter, but the judges weren't happy with this. They said, "No, we can't have manslaughter, it's not appropriate for the situation, it's got to be murder or acquittal." So the jury went back again, and this time they came back with the guilty verdict. Smith was sentenced to be hanged, and they didn't hang about. They were going to hang him next Monday, which was less than a week away. However, the case had caused such a fuss and so much sympathy, it was actually pushed up to the Crown, and Smith received a royal pardon. There was a stay of execution, and on the Tuesday after, the day after he was supposed to be hanged, he actually received a royal pardon on condition that he stay in prison for 1 year. So he did receive some punishment for his mistake. So you might think that was the end of the ghosts, right? But no. On January the 5th, further information came to the local magistrate concerning John Graham, who was a local shoemaker. Now, John Graham, by all accounts, was a very religious man, a very pious chap, and he got very annoyed because his apprentices, his young apprentices, started terrifying his children with stories of the ghost. They were really spooking them out, creeping them out, by telling them stories of the ghost. The children were very young, I guess. So he got very annoyed about that, so he thought, right, I'm going to get these apprentices back. So he dressed himself up as a ghost, and when the apprentices were coming home one night, he jumped out to scare them. Nothing really came of that as far as we know. Graham wasn't charged with anything. He was released. I think he was released on bail, and that was the end of that. But then there's another little twist, because now the story goes back to St Paul's, because a rumour went round the neighbourhood that this person had been ordered to do penance by the authorities, and the penance involved standing outside St Paul's Church dressed in a sheet by way of apologising to the local community. That was due to happen on the Sunday, so a huge crowd gathered to see this guy standing there in a sheet, and of course it was a false rumour, nothing happened. That seemed to be pretty much the end of the affair. There was still a lot of panic in the area. People were very wary about going out at night. They wouldn't go out on their own, and so on and so on. But there were no further sightings at that time, so gradually the panic subsided and things returned back to normal. Normal, that is, until 1824, when on February the 3rd, the Morning Herald posted the headline, "A New Hammersmith Ghost." And this reported a similar thing, except this time it was a tall white figure that was leaping out at women and terrifying them. And this time the story went national. It went across all the national papers. Now, this ghost seemed a little more proactive and certainly a lot more nasty. He attacked one man and broke his arm, and another woman, it reports, he leapt at her and swiped at her face, giving her cuts down the face as though he'd had hooks or claws on his fingers. So as I said, this is why he became known as the Hammersmith Monster rather than the Ghost, and once again the cry went up to form groups and parties to go out and track this monster down. And there was even a scheme suggested where perhaps either singly or in small groups men could go out dressed as women in order to lure the monster in. At one stage the monster even went into a house. He basically lifted the latch on the door and made his way into the house, terrifying the poor lady in residence. And she is reported as saying that what appeared in her doorway was a ghostly dressed figure with a large ugly mask and glaring eyeballs. Some flame was then emitted, after which the ghost exclaimed, "Good night, farewell," and decamped with supernatural rapidity. However, the monster was apprehended. February the 15th, a Mr. Worsley of Fulham was confronted by this ghostly figure on a horse. Mr. Worsley, though, obviously made of stern stuff, he wasn't having any of this. He grabbed the figure, pulled it off the horse, a scuffle ensued, and he managed to incapacitate and restrain the monster. It turned out this was a young man called John Benjamin, who was a young farmer from Alperton, who was apparently doing all this as a bit of a joke. Well, the magistrate didn't see the funny side of it, because Benjamin was sent to trial and was imprisoned for causing alarm and attacking people. Well, that was it. Everything settled down again. No more sightings, no excitement, nothing happening. And in fact, we have to leap forward to the 20th century and take a walk back to St Paul's Church to discover the next appearance of the Hammersmith Ghost. So we come back to where it all began, St Paul's Church, but this time we fast forward to 1955, to Friday, July the 9th to be precise, when the West London Observer ran the headline, "Hammersmith Ghost to reappear next Wednesday." Very specific, right? So they made the claim that that original ghost that assaulted Thomas Groom was actually the spectre of a man who cut his own throat in the churchyard here in December, January 1802 to 1803. So this was the ghost that appeared in the churchyard. This was the ghost that was then seen roaming the lanes of Hammersmith. They then claimed that this ghost had reappeared several times since that initial outbreak, and they spoke to at least one local person who claimed that they saw it 50 years ago, their grandfather saw it, all the way back to their great-grandmother. Every generation of the family had seen this ghost, and it was said to crop up at 50-year intervals here in the church, in August at a full moon. And of course, at that time, the next full moon in August was going to be Wednesday. This story caught on nationally. It was run across the national press, and it created a lot of interest, as you can imagine, of course. A lot of people said they were going to come down, from curious onlookers to locals to official ghost hunters. The staff at the church weren't too happy, the Virgin wasn't too happy about this, and the police said they were going to turn up, they were going to lock the gates, not let anyone in. Stay away. Well, of course, no one took any notice of that, and on the night, a huge crowd turned up here at the church. But the police stayed true to their word, they kept the gates locked, so the crowd instead gathered on the outside of the railings around the church here, peering in. So we can picture the scene, Wednesday the 3rd of August 1955, a full moon above. The Verger made sure that no one was allowed into the churchyard itself. Nonetheless, this huge crowd of people gathered round the outside of the railings here, peering in, waiting for something to manifest, waiting for something to happen. Midnight came, nothing happened. Well, I say nothing happened. I think there were one or two jokers in the crowd who tried to jump over the railings, maybe with a sheet on their head, something like that. They were very quickly dealt with by the police. Anyway, midnight came and went. I'm not sure why midnight is always the witching hour. That's something I need to look into. Perhaps if one of you out there knows why is midnight the witching hour, do let me know in the comments below. Anyway, midnight came and went. No ghosts, nothing happened. So, of course, the vast majority of the crowd faded away. All except for a few hardy ghost hunters who thought, one of them had the bright idea, hang on a minute, it's midnight now, but if we think of British summertime and the clock's going backwards and forwards, it's actually, in one sense, only 11 o'clock. So we're going to stay for another hour. We're going to stay till 1 o'clock to see what happens then. Well, their patience was rewarded, apparently, because the report is at 1 o'clock, a ghostly figure was seen to rise among the gravestones and glide through the churchyard to a tomb, where it hovered above the tomb and then slowly sank down into it and disappeared. And just for good measure, the apparition had no legs. Now, I've not been able to find any press cuttings about that report or anything else. Again, if anyone does know any more about it, I'd be interested to hear. So that's 1955. 2005, the press tried to rile the story up again, but there was no real interest at the time, and whether the ghost reappeared or not, no one was here to see it, apparently. So there we are, that's the story of the Hammersmith ghost and the Hammersmith monster. Make of that what you will. As always, if you enjoy weird fiction and horror stories and ghost stories and so on, please do take a listen to our podcast, the Innsmouth Book Club, that goes out once a fortnight. We're covering all aspects of weird fiction. And as I said, if you've got any further info on the Hammersmith ghost or the monster or anything else around this area, do let me know. So, that's it for now. I'm going to disappear and maybe I'll return in 2055.